The Helping Hands, read by Cate-Jayne. Jess sat at the bottom of the stairs, clinging wretchedly to the banister, horror and revulsion still pouring out of her, making her skin sweaty and her loose strands of blonde hair cling to her brow, trauma distorting her usually pretty features. The heavy wooden door swung open, marking the timely return home to the charming chocolate box cottage of her handsome husband Rob. Rob was, as usual, in high spirits. A quick trip to the local pub had helped, but he knew really he was still buzzing from the recent move into his grandfather's familiar old stone cottage. He thought it was great to be able to provide support and company for the old fella, and so far, he thought, smiling inside, it was working out quite well. He knew Jess wasn't as keen. She'd been looking forward to starting their own little family and hadn't really been swayed by Rob's idea of a wrinkly, cantankerous 73-year-old as a practice run. She'd been fantastic with him, though, made a proper effort, even helping him organise his dusty old manuscripts. He'd made a great choice there, he congratulated himself happily. He sniffed the air hungrily as he opened the door. He'd been eagerly anticipating returning home to his Sunday roast dinner. Starving as always after a supercharged rugby game, he'd never really been the kind of old-fashioned man who expected his dinner on the table. But his granddad had insisted on it last night, waving away his concerns about more work for Jess. Now his wary eyes took in the sight before him. His usually pristine wife, reduced to a sweaty mess at the bottom of the stairs, and minus a shoe by the look of it. He tossed his kit bag into the corner, automatically slotting his keys onto the ancient hook, nearly as old as the whitewashed stone wall that held it aloft, before quickly crossing the flagstoned hallway towards his stricken wife. "What's happened?" he asked, fruitlessly trying to swallow down the panic welling in his own voice. "Did you slip? Is Grandad all right?" Jess looked up at him with her broken face. Her trembling voice held an edge. "I've killed him! I hit him so many times! I think he's dead!" Jess had been enjoying the weekend. She'd had a rare night out with a friend from school, Emma. It had been lovely catching up. Since the move to the pretty Gloucestershire village that Rob's grandfather inhabited, they'd not had as much opportunity for shameless bitching. "It's a shame Rob can't be here," Emma had said. "Can't believe he preferred to stay at home with his grandpa." Her voice rose drunkenly at the end as she gave a snort of mock contempt, a habit that had been a part of her since school days, Jess observed with affection. She also knew that Emma didn't really mind Rob's absence. Tonight was gossip night. "He's gutted he had to stay at home and babysit," she lied easily. Rob had told her in no uncertain terms he wasn't coming to the meeting of the Witches' Coven. He'd borne the brunt of their scathing, cackling observations more times than he cared to recall. "So, what's it really like being the third wheel, Jess?" Emma probed slyly. "Has he started wearing cardigans yet?" she teased. "Emma, as if," Jess chastised. "Don't be so mean." As Emma got more drinks at the bar, Jess remembered her surprise at Rob's appearance at the top of the stairs. He'd come down to wave her off in the taxi. "Nice cardie," she spluttered. "Grandad said I could borrow it. It saves lighting the fire downstairs whilst we're playing cards." She'd smiled up at him, seen the wary look in his eyes. "Don't worry, I won't let Emma warp my mind. I know we're onto a good thing here. We'll keep our baby plans on hold and eventually find ourselves in a better position. I know. Emma's noisy reappearance with what she assumed were Jaeger shots brought her back to the present. She looked quizzically at her friend. "Oh, go on, Jess, we might as well. I won't be doing this for much longer. Not once I'm a responsible adult and have to act like a grown-up." She gave a super snort, chinked her glass against Jess's. "To partners in crime," she repeated their favoured toast, and downed her shot in one. Ever since high school, Jess and Emma had fantasised a future that intertwined with each other's. Jobs, boyfriends, babies. Oh my God, They'd discuss and plan babies in meticulous detail for hours on end, like only 14-year-olds can, even going as far as to assign godmother duties upon each other. Emma teased a strand of silky hair away from the bottom of her chestnut ponytail and twirled it around her index finger. It was a bit strange, really, she mused, seeing as neither of them were godly creatures and didn't possess godparents themselves. But looking back, it was probably based more on the twinkle-toed, starry-eyed, wing-flapping godmothers they'd read about in fairy tales, rather than any kindly human counterpart. Emma sighed to herself. She wished a fairy godmother would appear right now to wave a magic wand over the disaster story that was her life. She was going to have to quit her job, that much was clear. Since Emma and Sam had gone their separate ways, the once cosy office in the personal development department now contained an atmosphere that was heavy and claustrophobic. She knew instinctively that it was hard for the rest of the small team to stay neutral. They'd all worked so closely together. Gary, the original partner of the firm and a good friend to both members of the former dynamic duo, had been sympathetic from the beginning, trying to arrange a schedule that involved alternate working from home for the pair of them, so they'd all had a bit of breathing space, but Emma knew deep down that it would take more than that. Eventually, much discussion and heart-searching had led to this, the ultimate final conclusion in the Sam and Emma love story. Emma had gratefully taken advantage of the offered paid leave, a chance to move her wounded self and her possessions lock, stock and barrel back to her old childhood home. But she found she couldn't focus at all, not here, and especially not surrounded by her childhood things. For heaven's sake, she'd wasted an entire afternoon surrounded by once precious teddy bears and reading her old diaries, remembering sadly the hopeful teenager she'd been, reading about her dreams and ambitions. And now look at her. It really felt like she'd gone back a step. She was a failure. She lay mournfully in the narrow, too-short single bed of her childhood, ironically topped with a suitably sarcastic Garfield duvet cover. She'd sourly returned the dirty look he gave her as she crept back under the duvet. Oh yes, she thought to herself. It had been so easy to slip back into the safe, comforting arms of her mother, but it hadn't done a lot for her own ongoing personal development. She could weep as she thought of all her pretty ornaments and things she'd collected, now boxed up, unseen and redundant, in their new ugly cardboard homes in the corner of the room. She felt a strange affinity. She sighed deeply again, remembering the earlier awkward conversation in the kitchen, after she'd overheard her mother on the telephone discussing her situation. Really though, her mother had taken interfering to a new level and arranging her social life for her now. She'd slipped back into that fussing, overprotective parent mode too easily, thought Emma sulkily, then catching a sight of her stroppy reflection in the dressing table mirror, guiltily realised why. And she had to admit she was really looking forward to her evening drinks with Jess, her oldest friend from school, her one true partner in crime. Bill cast his roomy old eyes over the mantelpiece in the long-abandoned bedroom. He'd always loved the view from this window, in the days before the off-limits stairs. He'd even installed an ensuite bathroom. What would his mother have made of that? She'd not lived to see his success. He cast his mind back as he found he often did these days. Around 30 years ago it must have been, when the money from the sale of his books had first started to pour in. And those really were the days, he reminisced, when the money was new and filled with endless possibilities. The opportunity to live anywhere on the planet had been an option, but he'd known he wouldn't leave this old cottage. He plunked down wearily on the grey suede couch that had made an appearance, as his old mind wandered back and forth. It was in this very room, in front of that fireplace, he'd entered the world, and the view from the window over towards the beautiful rolling countryside was probably the first he'd ever clapped eyes on. More than 70 long years had passed since then. His thoughts becoming more morose now, as yet again he began imagining his own demise. He'd like a suitable period of viewing, and hopefully a bit of weeping and wailing from the gathered ladies of the village, Whilst he lay in this room, in his best bib and tucker, his gaze fell onto the modern side table. Bill pulled his best rigor mortis face at the mirrored tissue box. It would be a wooden box that would take him away, he snorted. Looking around him, he had to admit grudgingly, of course, the girl had made a good job. The dusty old cobwebs had vanished, and the extra bits and pieces she brought with her were very welcome. Now she was making huge inroads with his old office, apparently bringing it into the 21st century. There was even talk of her running her own business and calling it the Helping Hands. She'd rescued his old forgotten record player from underneath the mounds of paper in there, and blessedly it still had his favourite old album in the lid. The soundtrack to The Godfather had accompanied the clatter to the old word processor in its money-making glory days. Anyway, again he broke out of his reverie. She'd better keep her helping hands off his manuscripts, if she knew what was good for her. The troubling thing was, he wasn't entirely convinced that she did know what was good for her, although like most women, she did apparently know what was good for him. She threatened to kill him if he came up the stairs unsupervised again while she was out. Overnight, Bill had formulated a plan. It was no use waiting for Rob to take action. He'd waited all morning until he'd heard the ensuite bath noisily running. He'd fix it himself while the coast was clear. No worries about that now, he thought to himself as he carefully repacked one of the brown cardboard boxes she'd not yet got around to sorting. He put the heavy spanner he'd discovered back down the side. Earlier in the morning, whilst he'd been pottering about downstairs making breakfast in his self-contained apartment at the back of the cottage, he'd heard Rob creeping about, vainly attempting stealth. Obviously he didn't want to wake Jess. He mustn't have spoken to her since last night. She'd come home looking rather the worse for wear by all accounts. He continued to listen to Rob's clumsy movements from his side of the wall. Obviously not switched the light on by the stumbling sounds. Bill had hoped it was light enough for Rob to see the note he'd left for him. She'd come back to the cottage laden with a load of boxes, all breathless and excited, asking if he'd heard of the internet, cheeky cow. He'd faked indignation and threatened to show her his dongle. Ha! He cackled to himself. The look on her face was priceless. That had been the end of that conversation. He'd known she'd have to pop to the village shop to buy some last-minute bits for lunch. She'd been chatting for ages, apparently, to the sporty young fellow whose parents owned the shop. He only helped his parents on Sunday afternoons after the rugby. The rest of the time he messed around making websites for businesses, and any time she needed his help, any time at all she had to do was call. Of course, he'd have to mention that to Rob. He rubbed at his whiskery chin speculatively. They'd had a good chat last night, he surmised, with Jess out of the way. Rob had confirmed that maybe Jess wasn't as cut out for a role as a carer as he'd hoped, and she missed her friends, apparently. Bill had felt a bit upset. He hadn't asked them to move in to look after him. He wasn't an invalid. He'd wanted company, a new lease of life, something to look forward to instead of backwards all the time. And you never know, he might get over his infernal writer's block if he had a bit of youthful drama around him. Maybe another woman might be nice, he'd suggested boldly. Rob had been a bit taken aback when he realised his granddad wasn't kidding, but said he'd think about it. Sighing inwardly as he remembered their conversation. Bill knew Rob of old, and for all his rugby muscles and rugged good looks, he wasn't the most manly of men. Bill guessed he must be one of those metrosexual types they'd banged on about a few years back, whenever you watch daytime telly. He hadn't a clue how to light that fire last night. Put a cardigan on instead. Bill sighed heavily. Sometimes he needed a little push. I've killed him, Rob. I hit him so many times I think he's dead. Jess was gabbling now, looking back up the stairs in fear. What the hell are you telling me, Jess? What have you done? His thoughts raced back unwittingly to the previous evening's conversation. Did Jess know something? And what was with the note he'd found this morning telling him to go to the pub before dinner? Had Grandad deliberately kept him away from the cottage? Calm down, sister, a disembodied voice called from the bathroom. He is dead. Dead as a doornail. You did a real good job. Emma appeared on the landing, holding Jess's missing shoe like a club. Rob rubbed at his brow in confusion. Emma, I thought you'd gone home. Jess pushed past her husband and ran halfway up the stairs, her bare foot sounding oddly clubbed against the sharp clack that its elegantly shod partner made. He's definitely gone? Emma nodded gravely. Yep, don't go in there though. It's like a scene from a horror film. He snorted madly. Jess had started to wring her hands as she digested the news Emma had so casually imparted, and now looked as if she might actually be sick. Cautiously now, feeling quite short of breath and panicky, his dark chestnut hair prickling wildly at the roots, Rob climbed up the staircase, acutely aware of each familiar creak and groan. Grandad, he called out, his own voice rasping now out of fear. He spun round, wild-eyed, as machinery started up at the foot of the staircase, a whirring noise behind him. It sounded like a chainsaw. What the? He stared aghast as the apparition of his grandad glided past them all on the rickety old stair lift, his face horrifically contorted into the rictus grin he'd practised just a few short hours ago. He wore the saucy maid's outfit Emma had bought him for his birthday. Her sparkly embellished pink rubber gloves covered his gnarled hands, and a disinfectant bottle shaped like a wand was wedged under his arm. All this fuss over a flaming spider, he called down to Rob as he made his way round the bend. You do know it's you lot your sister needs to move in and look after, not me, he snorted, sounding just like his granddaughter. By the way, Rob, she's got her eye on that mate of yours in the shop, the one you play rugby with. Try and get her a discount for this new business venture she's been banging on about, eh? Jess, grinning and looking more like her old self now she had both shoes on, grabbed her blushing sister-in-law by the arm and, disappearing with her partner in crime, back into their newly allocated office to continue chatting about their new business venture, cheekily calling over her shoulder as she went. The dining table's all set and Grandad said the roast is nearly ready, Rob. So if you need us, we'll be in our coven. Emma chimed in. And by the way, brother dearest, us witches got the log fire going again eventually, so maybe lose the cardigan. Rob wearily made his way back down the stairs to finish Grandad's dinner, tempted momentarily to use the newly repaired stair lift, but then thinking better of it, at least until he got someone in to double-check his impatient grandfather's handiwork. He fancied he could hear old Bill in the ensuite bathroom above his head, and smiled affectionately as he once again pictured him in his pinny and gloves, merrily cleaning spider brains from the tiles, and he strained his ears to listen, hugging the cosy cardigan tighter around his muscly body. He was whistling the theme from The Godfather. Of all things.